Hi there! Video number 3 from Alex at the Museum of Timekeeping, doing the museum from home. Today we're going to have a look at the history of the Radium Girls. The Radium Girls were from America at the turn of the 20th century, and they began working in factories in around 1917. So they were doing their bit for the war effort. It was really the first time in America that women had had financial freedom from their parents or from their husbands and were able to carve out their own living. One of the very best paid jobs that you could have as a woman in the early part of the 20th century was to work in the factories painting military watches, and what that involved was painting the dials of the watches with a newly discovered element called radium. Now, radium had only been discovered about 20 years before by the now famous Marie Curie, and it had some wonderful properties. It glowed in the dark. Now, this meant it was ideal for the watch dials of military watches because the military personnel would be able to see their watches in low light levels. Brilliant stuff. It also was amongst the top 5% of high-paying jobs for women. So when I said it was one of the best, it really was a very well-paid position and a very sought-after role for young women. It was specifically women who were chosen to do this work because it was felt that their small hands would be more dexterous and would be better suited to the fine work of painting these dials. Now, the radium that they were given was not only really good for the purpose that it was being used for, it was also a lot of fun for these women. And there are reports that women regularly played with it whilst they were on duty, shall we say, and they would paint their fingernails, they would paint eyeliner, they would paint their teeth with it, put highlights in their hair. And on top of that, they also earned the nickname the Ghost Girls, and that was because by the end of their painting shift, they had been exposed to such a high level of radium that they would come out glowing green at the end of their shift. So, of course, we now recognise that that is a really serious problem, but in the 1910s, 20s, even into the 1930s, the dangers of radium exposure hadn't yet been investigated, and the general populace weren't aware of just how dangerous this was. However, that didn't last for very long because the women working in these factories began to become unwell. And in fact, by the early 1930s, nearly all of the women who had been working in the radium factories through the First World War and through the interwar period had quite significant health problems, which ranged from a selection of different cancers, an awful disease known as radium jaw, and problems with fertility and problems with birth defects in the infants that they did manage to carry. The reason that the jaw was such a vulnerable part of the body for these women is that whilst they were doing their painting, they would sharpen their paintbrushes by licking their lips and using their lips to shape the paintbrush. So whilst doing so, they were unknowingly ingesting quite large quantities of radium, which of course over time caused horrendous radiation sickness. I'm going to show you one example of an early military watch, and I appreciate that this doesn't translate too well on video, so there'll be photographs in the post as well. But this watch here, you can see that all of the numbers and the hands themselves have been painted with radium. And if I shut that up, it has a half hunter case, and the half hunter case here you can see is to protect that whilst still giving you a window so you can see the time whilst it's on your wrist. And this example dates from about 1917, 1918, so one of the earliest radium painted wristwatches. Now, although it really was all doom and gloom for the women, they actually took their employers, 3 factories in New Jersey, in Illinois and in Connecticut, to court in 1938. a group of them approached the courts with the idea that it was not their own fault that they had become ill, but rather negligence on the part of their employer. It was a landmark case because in the past, all onus for health and safety of the employee had fallen to the employee rather than the employer. However, because of the gravity of this case and because so many women were adversely affected by their work, they won. And that case paved the way for Health and Safety at Work Acts that we still enjoy today. So really, these women left a huge legacy in terms of employment law. Thank you.